Hello. I will say something about 4 types of text that we use when we create the digital learning materials, ebooks and MOOCs. This is a sort of introductory comment on a somewhat different topic, namely what we will refer to as, let us see now, emergent properties. Emergent properties are dimensions and characteristics of a complex phenomena that cannot be derived from its parts. And this is very interesting when we develop, when new things come into play, when new things arrive on the scene or show themselves in society. And we have been used to talk about like biological system with the brain as the most significant example, because we cannot derive consciousness from the individual cells or electrochemical processes in the brain by themselves, but in the totality we know we are conscious, and that is an emergent properties of brains. Now what we're looking for are emergent properties of e-learning and e-learning documents, the new types of textbooks. And my contention is that these 4 types of text are emergent properties that helps us to define and operate and create new learning resources, new ways of teaching and learning. And that is to some extent opposed to a tradition whereby pedagogics are used as the sort of defining conceptual underpinning of e-learning. And I will use a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean by that. So in this first case, we have double bookkeeping. It's a conceptual approach to handling economies of businesses and organizations. Well, it has a precursor in the 15th century with books on mathematics, where double bookkeeping is a concept, but it has a longer history back in time to the the Korean peninsula and other places in the world where they also had this concept much earlier. And here is a sort of an older book where we can sort of imagine we do double bookkeeping. Now, if we introduce digital tools in bookkeeping, and we use still the double bookkeeping principle, and the principle is the same. It's a different implementation. So the concept of double bookkeeping is not something that sort of emerges from digitalization. It was there all along. It was there 500 years before. So that is a classical way of thinking that is implemented differently, but not fundamentally changed when we digitize. Now, the important example is, of course, pedagogics. And here we are back in the medieval times with a lecture on the stand here, some people talking together or watching each other or sleeping or whatever, and some are listening, of course, not totally unlike the situation before COVID and even more so during COVID. And then we have the digital textbook and the learning approaches. And then one pedagogical principle is to define the transition, composition of operational and conceptual work. Should the students learn the theory before they are allowed to practice, which has been very much the case in many professions, or should it be the other way around, more in line with the traditional modes, where you work on the problems first, you get the feel for it in your hands, and then you learn a conceptual. And of course, my view, of course, would be to sort of mix the two, and that would be pragmatic reasons where you start. But generally, it's the operational approach where you learn by doing, which is the underpinning of conceptual understanding. Otherwise, it becomes stale and scholastic. Well, be that as it may, the point is that the pedagogical principle of switching between operational and conceptual is not a new thing that comes with digitalization, even if it becomes different with digitalization. So that is not an emergent property. The same with the Vygotskian concept of zonal proximal development, which is something students can do by themselves, something they cannot do even if they get some help. But there's an area, a zone between the two, where they can manage if they get appropriate help, but they don't manage if they don't get that. And that's exactly where teaching and learning should take place. That's where the resources from the teachers and the online textbook should be sort of directed at that zone. That's also a classical concept. That didn't come with digitalization, even if it will find new and interesting ways of implementing that principle. So these two principles, switching between operational and conceptual, and defining the zone of proximal development and putting emphasis of finding that and exploring that field and pushing the students to know things that they can do with the support, but not what they cannot do. That are two important pedagogical principles, but they didn't come with digitalization. They are not emergent properties. So the criteria here is that the double bookkeeping and these two pedagogical principles are equally important with paper as with electronics, e-learning. And that's the main distinction. So emergent properties for the 4 types of text that we will deal with, these types are meaningless, more or less, at least as a composite, without digital conditions. And that's what we are going to explore. Thank you for your attention.